September 10, 1944. British Airborne Headquarters, London. The war room was quiet in the way offices become quiet when no one expects bad news to arrive. Major Brian Urquhart sat alone at his desk, leaning over a set of aerial reconnaissance photographs spread beneath a magnifying glass. He did not need the glass anymore. He had already seen enough to understand what the images meant. German armored vehicles were visible in clear formation. Not wreckage, not abandoned hulks. Operational tanks. Around them, troop concentrations arranged with the discipline of experienced units. These were not retreating remnants. They were refitting formations. 2 SS Panzer divisions, positioned exactly where British airborne forces were scheduled to land in 1 week. The photographs matched everything else on his desk. Ultra intercepts confirming German communications traffic. Reports from the Dutch resistance describing armored movement near Arnhem. Separate intelligence streams, independent of one another, all converging on the same conclusion. The landing zone was occupied. The enemy was prepared. Urquhart gathered the photographs and left his office. He walked them directly to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commander of the British Airborne Corps. The meeting was brief. Urquhart laid the images on the desk and explained what they showed. Tanks, SS units, combat-ready formations within the drop area. He spoke carefully, methodically, as an intelligence officer trained to separate evidence from interpretation. Browning did not engage with the material. He glanced at the photographs and dismissed the assessment. He said the Germans were finished. He said these units were remnants reorganizing, incapable of affecting the operation. He told Urquhart he was being too cautious. Urquhart pressed the point. The tanks were operational. The intercepts were current. The reports were corroborated. This was not speculation. Browning ended the discussion. The warning moved upward anyway. Montgomery's headquarters received the intelligence. The response was colder. Operation Market Garden had already been approved. Resources allocated. Eisenhower's consent secured. The plan was no longer a proposal. It was a commitment. Montgomery's staff characterized the intelligence as pessimism. They questioned the judgment of a junior officer. One suggested Urquhart was suffering from nervous strain. Browning ordered him to take a week's leave. The warning was removed from the system by removing the man who delivered it. The decision was now complete. No revision, no delay, no adjustment to account for German armored presence at Arnhem. At the command level, the matter was considered closed. The operation would proceed as planned. The intelligence was known. The risk was understood. The choice was deliberate. In that moment, inside British headquarters, Operation Market Garden ceased to be a gamble based on uncertainty. It became a gamble made with full awareness. At that moment in September 1944, the opportunity before the Allied command was narrow, technical, and entirely dependent on execution rather than optimism. Operation Market Garden was not conceived as a broad offensive. It was a precision maneuver built on timing, distance, and control. 3 airborne divisions would be dropped deep behind German lines to seize a sequence of bridges stretching from the Belgian border to Arnhem. British ground forces would then drive north along a single elevated highway to link up with them. The entire operation rested on one requirement: speed. From a purely military standpoint, the plan was not irrational. Allied air superiority was complete. There was no serious Luftwaffe presence capable of disrupting the airborne landings. The Allies possessed the largest transport fleet ever assembled, enough to deliver entire divisions, artillery, and supplies in successive waves. Airborne forces were trained specifically for this kind of mission: rapid seizure of key terrain, temporary defense, and handoff to advancing armor. German forces west of the Rhine were widely dispersed following the collapse in France. Many formations were under strength, short on fuel, and still reorganizing. The German command structure was fragmented. Communications were unreliable. In theory, this created exploitable gaps between defensive positions. The logic of Market Garden assumed that airborne troops would arrive before the Germans could react coherently. Bridges would be seized intact. Road junctions would be secured. Local resistance would be minimal and disorganized. British armor, once committed, would move faster than the enemy could concentrate. If that sequence held, the corridor would form. The Rhine would be crossed. Allied forces would be established on the far bank before German defenses could solidify. From there, the industrial Ruhr lay exposed, and the operational balance in Western Europe would shift decisively. The opportunity existed because the Germans had been driven faster than their command system could adapt. Rapid Allied movement had repeatedly forced German withdrawals without deliberate defense. The airborne component of Market Garden was designed to exploit that pattern one final time, at greater depth and with greater risk. Logistically, the plan was fragile but workable on paper. Supplies were staged. Air resupply was planned. The ground column's route, while narrow, was elevated and defensible. If the timetable held, German interdiction would arrive too late to matter. Crucially, the operation did not require prolonged airborne defense. The paratroopers were not meant to fight a sustained battle. They were intended to hold bridges for hours, not days. Their light equipment reflected that assumption. Success depended on rapid relief, not endurance. Under those conditions, the opportunity was real. Not guaranteed, but real. The operation could succeed only if German resistance was limited, uncoordinated, and slow to respond. It required an accurate assessment of enemy capability and immediate adjustment if that assessment proved wrong. What Market Garden offered was not a margin for error, but a window. A short one. The Allied command had the resources to pass through it, but only if every element aligned with the intelligence picture. The opportunity did not disappear because the plan was impossible. It disappeared because the plan demanded realism at every stage. Timing could not slip. Assumptions could not be indulged. Enemy strength had to be confronted directly, not explained away. The operation was viable only under the conditions intelligence had already invalidated. That distinction mattered. Market Garden was not doomed by ambition alone. It was endangered by the refusal to redefine the opportunity when new information narrowed it further. The window was still there, but it had already begun to close. In the days before the operation, the warning did not emerge from intuition or anxiety. It emerged from process. Major Brian Urquhart's role within the British Airborne Corps was narrowly defined. He was not a strategist. He did not design operations. He identified threats to airborne landings and assessed whether assumptions matched reality. His credibility rested on method, not rank. By early September, his assessment was complete. It did not rely on a single source or interpretation. Ultra-decrypts showed German armored units being directed toward the Arnhem area. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed the physical presence of tanks and support vehicles. Dutch resistance reports described troop concentrations and refitting activity. These were not fragments. They were layers. Urquhart mapped the information against the Market Garden plan. Drop zones, march routes, bridge objectives, timetables. The overlap was exact. The British 1st Airborne Division was scheduled to land within reach of 2 SS Panzer divisions capable of immediate counterattack. The airborne timetable assumed hours of light resistance. The intelligence suggested minutes before contact. His preparation reflected that conclusion. He identified the specific units involved. He assessed their operational status. He estimated reaction times based on road networks and German command practices. He did not argue that the operation was impossible. He argued that it was being planned against an enemy that no longer existed in that form. Urquhart did not elevate his warning rhetorically. He did not frame it as alarm. He presented it as a correction. The plan assumed weakened, disorganized German remnants. The intelligence demonstrated organized, armored formations refitting within the operational area. He prepared briefings accordingly. He did not recommend cancellation. He implied the need for adjustment. Altered drop zones, heavier fire support, faster relief, or acknowledgement that airborne forces might face immediate armored opposition. His assessment was technically sound. It aligned with established airborne doctrine. Light infantry could seize objectives, but could not withstand armored counterattack without rapid reinforcement. This was not controversial. It was foundational. Urquhart's warning also addressed the psychological dimension of the plan. Market Garden depended on momentum. The assumption was that German morale was collapsing. His intelligence suggested the opposite at Arnhem, rested units, reorganizing after withdrawal, with experienced leadership and intact command structures. The warning extended beyond Arnhem itself. Urquhart understood that if the northernmost objective failed, the entire corridor would fracture. The airborne chain was sequential. A break at the end collapsed the whole. He did not personalize his assessment. He did not criticize Montgomery directly. He focused on the operational mismatch. What the plan required and what the enemy could now deliver were no longer aligned. Within intelligence channels, this assessment was respected. There was no dispute over the data. The photographs were clear. The intercepts were verified. The resistance reports were consistent. No competing intelligence contradicted them. What failed was not preparation, but reception. When Urquhart briefed Browning, he encountered not technical rebuttal but conceptual resistance. The warning conflicted with the narrative already established, that the Germans were broken, that speed alone would finish them, that hesitation was more dangerous than risk. When the assessment reached Montgomery's staff, it collided with institutional momentum. The operation had political weight. Resources had been concentrated. Allied priorities had been reshaped around it. Intelligence that threatened that structure was treated as obstruction. Urquhart's credibility was not attacked through evidence. It was undermined administratively. His caution was reframed as psychological strain. His role was paused. His analysis remained on file, unacted upon. The warning, however, had already done its work. It defined the limits of what the airborne forces could endure. It clarified that the operation's success required either denial of German armor or immediate relief. It established that delay would not produce gradual difficulty, but catastrophic isolation. The assessment did not predict defeat. It predicted exposure. It showed precisely where the operation would break if assumptions failed. Nothing in Urquhart's preparation proved incorrect. German forces at Arnhem responded exactly as anticipated. Armored units moved rapidly. Airborne forces were engaged before consolidation. Relief was delayed. Isolation followed. The warning was not prophetic. It was procedural. It demonstrated that the operation's margin for error had already vanished before the first aircraft took off. By the time the operation began, the intelligence function had already completed its task. What remained was whether command would accept its conclusions. The overrule did not arrive as a single command. It emerged through pressure, alignment, and institutional convenience. By mid-September 1944, Operation Market Garden had moved beyond the realm of military planning and into the domain of political commitment. Resources had been promised. Public expectations had been shaped. Allied strategy had been bent to accommodate one operation presented as decisive. At that stage, altering the plan was no longer a technical question. It was a political one. Field Marshal Montgomery had secured his position carefully. He had argued that a concentrated thrust under British leadership would end the war before winter. He had framed the operation not merely as an advance, but as a solution. This mattered. The Allied High Command was under pressure to demonstrate momentum after the liberation of Paris. Supply lines were stretched. American forces were advancing rapidly, drawing attention and credit. British leadership required a defining success of its own. Montgomery understood this environment. He presented Market Garden as that success. He demanded priority for fuel, aircraft, and airborne forces. He insisted that delay would squander opportunity. His confidence was absolute, and it was delivered upward as assurance rather than argument. General Eisenhower recognized the risks. He understood the vulnerability of a single supply route. He saw the dependency on weather, timing, and coordination. He was aware of intelligence indicating stronger German presence than publicly acknowledged. His staff raised objections. American commanders expressed concern. None of this halted the process. Eisenhower's authority was real, but constrained. His role was not simply to choose sound operations. It was to maintain the alliance. Churchill was pressing for a British-led offensive. British political leadership wanted visible results. Rejecting Montgomery's plan outright would provoke political conflict at a moment when unity mattered more than efficiency. The structure of Allied command reinforced this dynamic. Major strategic decisions were negotiated, not imposed. Consensus mattered. National prestige mattered. Public perception mattered. Within that system, Montgomery's proposal carried weight beyond its military merits. Intelligence did not fail to reach decision-makers. It failed to alter them. Reports warning of German armored formations were received, discussed, and discounted, not because they were disproven, but because they threatened the narrative already in motion. Montgomery's staff filtered dissent efficiently. Warnings were described as pessimism. Concerns were framed as lack of nerve. Junior officers were dismissed as inexperienced. This was not accidental. It was institutional defense. A plan that had already secured political backing could not be allowed to appear fragile. Lieutenant General Browning's role was central. As commander of the airborne forces, he was responsible for assessing risk. He chose reassurance over adjustment. Acknowledging the intelligence would require altering drop zones, requesting additional fire support, or admitting that airborne troops might be asked to fight beyond their design. That admission would ripple upward and delay the operation. He chose not to make it. The culture within Montgomery's headquarters rewarded confidence and punished contradiction. Success was assumed. Doubt was treated as obstruction. Intelligence officers existed to confirm feasibility, not to redefine it. Montgomery himself did not deny the existence of German forces. He minimized their significance. He asserted that the enemy was demoralized, incapable of coordinated resistance. This assumption allowed him to absorb contradictory intelligence without altering conclusions. The Germans were present, but irrelevant. That framing preserved the plan intact. Political timing reinforced the decision. Autumn weather threatened future airborne operations. Supply constraints made a pause unattractive. Churchill wanted momentum. Montgomery promised resolution. Eisenhower weighed the costs of refusal against the risks of approval and chose the latter. Once Eisenhower authorized the operation and committed American airborne divisions, reversal became practically impossible. Aircraft schedules were set. Units were briefed. The scale of the operation itself created inertia. To cancel or redesign, it would signal uncertainty at the highest level. The overrule, then, was systemic. No single officer silenced intelligence. The system absorbed it and moved on. Each layer deferred responsibility upward while reinforcing the same conclusion. The plan would proceed. This mechanism protected reputations. It preserved alliance cohesion. It avoided public dispute. It also ensured that intelligence lost its function at the moment it mattered most. The decision-makers did not believe they were ignoring reality. They believed they were managing it. Risk was reframed as boldness. Caution was equated with timidity. The possibility of failure was acknowledged abstractly, but discounted operationally. By the time the final approval was given, Market Garden was no longer evaluated against current conditions. It was measured against promises already made. Intelligence that contradicted those promises became an inconvenience rather than a guide. The overrule was not dramatic. There were no raised voices or explicit denials. There was only alignment. Political desire, institutional momentum, personal confidence, and alliance management converged on the same outcome. The warning remained on paper. The plan moved forward. From that point onward, the operation was insulated from reconsideration. The chain of command had chosen coherence over correction. What followed was no longer a matter of chance. It was the execution of a decision already sealed. The consequences unfolded exactly along the fault lines already identified, and they did so without delay. On the afternoon of September 17, 1944, the airborne armada crossed the Dutch coast. Thousands of aircraft filled the sky. The drops themselves were not the problem. Weather was favorable. Navigation was accurate. Most units landed where planned. At the outset, the operation appeared to validate the confidence that had driven it forward. That impression did not last. At the southern and central objectives, American airborne divisions secured several bridges after hard but manageable fighting. These successes reinforced the belief at higher headquarters that the plan was working. Reports emphasized progress. Delays were described as temporary. The assumption of momentum remained intact. At Arnhem, the conditions were different from the first hour. British airborne units encountered organized resistance almost immediately. German forces reacted not as scattered remnants, but as coordinated formations. Armored units moved with speed and purpose. Command elements were intact. Counterattacks were not improvised. They were deliberate. The British 1st Airborne Division failed to seize the Arnhem Bridge in full. A small force reached the northern end, but it was isolated. German armor arrived faster than anticipated, cutting movement between British units and sealing off routes to the bridge. Communications deteriorated. Planned link-ups did not occur. The timetable, which had allowed no margin for delay, collapsed within the first day. German forces exploited the airborne limitations precisely as intelligence had predicted. Light infantry could hold ground briefly, but could not maneuver under armored pressure. Anti-tank weapons were insufficient. Ammunition consumption exceeded resupply capacity. Casualties mounted. Relief from the ground was delayed at every stage. The single highway became congested. German counterattacks severed the route repeatedly. Each interruption compounded the delay. Each delay increased the pressure on airborne units already operating beyond their design limits. The British paratroopers at Arnhem were soon encircled. They were forced into defensive pockets. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded accumulated. Resupply drops fell into German hands or landed beyond reach. Radio contact with higher headquarters became intermittent and then ceased. For 9 days, the division fought in isolation. This was not a dramatic last stand in the abstract sense. It was attrition. Positions were reduced methodically. Buildings were destroyed. Units were fragmented. Commanders were killed or captured. The fighting consumed the division's strength in a slow, irreversible process. Of the roughly 10,000 British airborne troops deployed at Arnhem, fewer than a quarter escaped. The remainder were killed, wounded, or captured. The division ceased to exist as a fighting force. These losses were not confined to British units. American airborne divisions, committed to objectives further south, also suffered heavy casualties as German forces regrouped and counterattacked along the corridor. Polish paratroopers, dropped late and into deteriorating conditions, were exposed to the same dynamics without the benefit of initial momentum. In total, Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The strategic result was nothing. No Rhine crossing. No corridor into Germany. No collapse of German resistance. The front stabilized short of the objective. The war did not end before winter. It did not accelerate. It slowed. Every element of the failure traced back to the same decision point. The airborne forces did not fail tactically. They executed their orders within the limits imposed upon them. What failed was the assumption that those limits would not be tested. The German response at Arnhem was not unexpected. It was documented in advance. The speed of the counterattack, the use of armor, the isolation of drop zones, and the inability of airborne troops to hold against sustained pressure were all foreseeable. What was not anticipated at higher command levels was the speed at which the consequences compounded once the initial assumption proved false. There was no mechanism to adapt the plan mid-execution. Once the airborne forces were committed, there was no option to reinforce them adequately or extract them safely. The operation had been designed as an all-or-nothing effort. When it failed to achieve its northern objective quickly, it defaulted to attrition. The failure also imposed secondary consequences across the Allied front. Resources concentrated on Market Garden were unavailable elsewhere. American armies advancing in other sectors experienced supply shortages. Opportunities created by German disarray in early September were not exploited fully because priority had been reassigned. German forces, given time and space by the failed operation, reorganized. Defensive lines stabilized. The initiative shifted. Within Allied command, the aftermath was managed carefully. Public criticism was muted. Responsibility was diffuse. Montgomery attributed the failure to weather, delayed relief, and intelligence shortcomings. The intelligence itself had predicted the outcome, but its role was reframed after the fact. Eisenhower absorbed the failure without public rupture. The alliance remained intact. Montgomery retained command. No senior figure was removed or formally censured for the operation. The airborne forces bore the cost. Market Garden did not produce a dramatic reversal of fortune. It produced a measurable loss of capability. Experienced airborne units were destroyed or rendered ineffective. Replacement and retraining would take months. The Allies entered the winter of 1944 with fewer options and diminished flexibility. The German army, though still strategically doomed, had been given something it desperately needed: time. That time allowed the Germans to regroup in the West, to prepare defenses, and to launch counteroffensives later in the year. The cost of those later battles would be paid by different units, but the delay that enabled them began at Arnhem. The consequence, then, was not simply defeat at one bridge. It was the validation of every warning that had been dismissed. The intelligence had not exaggerated German capability. It had understated nothing. The airborne forces had not been unlucky. They had been placed in a situation where endurance was substituted for relief. The command decision did not fail because it was bold. It failed because it converted known risk into unavoidable loss. Once the plan moved forward unchanged, the outcome followed mechanically. German armor counterattacked. Airborne units were isolated. Relief was delayed. Casualties accumulated. Withdrawal became inevitable. By the time the survivors crossed the Rhine back to friendly lines, the decision that had sealed their fate was already weeks old. Nothing that happened on the ground contradicted the intelligence. It confirmed it. The battlefield did not reveal new information. It simply enacted the consequences of ignoring what was already known. Operation Market Garden ended not with ambiguity, but with clarity. The cost was visible, counted, and irreversible. The consequences were not accidental. They were executed. In the post-war record, Operation Market Garden did not remain ambiguous for long. As documents were released and participants wrote their accounts, the internal mechanics of the decision became clearer, not more defensible. British and American archives confirmed that intelligence regarding German armored formations near Arnhem had been received before the operation began. Ultra-decrypts, aerial reconnaissance, and resistance reports were all logged, circulated, and acknowledged. There was no evidentiary gap. The question was never whether the information existed, but how it was treated. Major Brian Urquhart's assessments were preserved in files. They matched later German records with striking accuracy. Post-war interrogations of German commanders confirmed that the SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem were refitting, rested, and capable of immediate counterattack. Their reaction time was measured in hours, not days. Their presence was not accidental. It was structural. German after-action reports described Market Garden not as a surprise, but as an opportunity. Airborne landings were observed, assessed, and countered by formations already in place. The German command was not improvising under pressure. It was responding with assets it knew it possessed. Allied memoirs revealed a pattern of deflection. Montgomery acknowledged intelligence failures, but framed them as incomplete rather than disregarded. He emphasized weather, timing, and execution. He did not address why warnings that aligned with enemy records were dismissed before the operation began. Eisenhower's post-war reflections were more restrained. He accepted responsibility for approving the operation, but emphasized alliance considerations. He did not contest the intelligence itself. Instead, he framed the decision as a calculated risk taken under political and strategic pressure. Other Allied commanders were less charitable. American officers privately described Market Garden as avoidable. The diversion of airborne forces, aircraft, and supplies away from other sectors was criticized in internal correspondence. The operation was increasingly viewed as a misuse of scarce assets at a moment when German defenses were weakest elsewhere. The British 1st Airborne Division became a symbol rather than a subject. Its losses were commemorated, but rarely analyzed in terms of command responsibility. The narrative focused on valor under impossible conditions, which was accurate, but incomplete. The conditions had not been inevitable. They had been chosen. No formal inquiry reassigned blame. No senior commander was relieved as a result of Market Garden. The alliance moved on. Winter operations demanded attention. New crises emerged. The failure was absorbed institutionally. Yet the documentary record left little room for reinterpretation. The operation did not fail because intelligence was wrong. It failed because intelligence was inconvenient. Later historians, working without wartime constraints, reached similar conclusions independently. The assumptions underlying Market Garden were shown to be false at the time they were made. The decision to proceed unchanged was driven by confidence, political momentum, and the desire for a decisive British-led victory. The post-war record also clarified what Market Garden cost beyond casualties. Airborne forces required extensive rebuilding. Experienced leadership was lost. Operational flexibility was reduced. The delay in crossing the Rhine allowed German forces to reorganize and contributed indirectly to later battles that would exact their own toll. What the documents do not show is confusion. There is no evidence of misunderstanding at the top. The intelligence was clear. The risks were known. The decision was not blind. In hindsight, Market Garden stands as an example of how modern coalition warfare can distort command judgment. The need to manage alliances, prestige, and public expectation created an environment where altering a plan became more dangerous politically than executing it militarily. That environment protected reputations while consuming units. The record closes without controversy. The facts align. The warnings existed. The overrule was deliberate. The outcome followed. There is no unresolved debate in the archives. The failure does not rest on hindsight. It rests on documents written before the first aircraft lifted off. The post-war record does not ask what might have happened. It records what was known, what was decided, and what it cost. Nothing in that record contradicts the conclusion already visible in September 1944. The case was closed long before the war ended. The decision that determined the outcome of Operation Market Garden was not made over Arnhem, nor in the air over the Netherlands. It was made days earlier, inside headquarters, when intelligence was acknowledged and then set aside. That decision was to proceed unchanged. German armored formations at Arnhem were known. Their readiness was documented. Their proximity to the drop zones was clear. This information did not arrive late, nor was it ambiguous. It was delivered through multiple channels and confirmed independently. Command chose not to act on it. The operation was approved because it satisfied political needs, alliance pressures, and personal confidence. It promised speed. It promised resolution. It promised a British-led conclusion to the war. Those promises became more important than the conditions required to fulfill them. When intelligence threatened that narrative, it was neutralized administratively. Warnings were reframed as pessimism. Dissent was treated as weakness. The plan was protected from revision by the very system meant to evaluate it. What followed was not misfortune. It was execution. Airborne forces were inserted into an environment they were never meant to endure. Armored counterattacks arrived exactly as predicted. Relief was delayed exactly as anticipated. Isolation, attrition, and destruction followed mechanically. The battlefield did not surprise the command. It confirmed the intelligence that had already been dismissed. No senior commander was removed. No formal reckoning followed. The alliance remained intact. Reputation survived. Units did not. Market Garden failed not because it was bold, but because it was insulated from correction. It transformed known risk into unavoidable loss. The casualties were not the cost of uncertainty. They were the cost of certainty ignored. This was not a tragedy of chance. It was a failure of choice. The record leaves no ambiguity. The warning was clear. The overrule was deliberate. The consequences were predictable. The case is closed. If you want the next segment examining how daily command decisions at Arnhem compounded this failure hour by hour, subscribe and leave a comment.